Now on 4, after 40 years, Secret History opens the doors on the organisation that's funded the struggle against apartheid in South Africa.
Peoples are coughing. The peoples are coughing. The peoples are saying. The peoples are saying. The peoples are coughing. The peoples are coughing. The peoples are coughing. Somshaya ngecha, somshaya ngecha, somshaya ngemoja, thina somshaya ngemoja, thina somshaya ngemoja.
Meeting come to order. This is the 41st meeting of the Finance Committee of the International Defence and Aid Fund for Southern Africa. We expect it will be the final meeting. I greet you very welcome to this occasion.
This is the story of a clandestine organisation operating from the heart of London, which secretly underpinned the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Founded in the early 1950s by Canon John Collins of St Paul's Cathedral, the Defence and Aid Fund managed to outwit the South African Secret Services. Until now, quite how this was done has remained a closely guarded secret, hidden among the IDAF archives. These files contain thousands of moving personal histories of the 40-year-long fight against white rule.
The Finance Committee members are myself, William Frankel to my left, and Horst Kleinschmidt. Al Cook is our secretary. And I've asked Diana Collins, one of the very original members of IDAF, representing, in a way, the continuation of activities under the old foundation.
There were two organizations that we struggled with a lot, and one was Defence and Aid Fund, and the other was the South African Communist Party. They were the two that were the most impervious to infiltration.
The publications department was down on the ground floor, but there was always the threat of penetration by the South African security services. And so we had the basic principle of our security was that the higher you went up in the building, the higher the level of security. And we're now approaching the highest level of security, the top floor, guarded by devices such as the camera up there and by the locks on the door. And we're now entering what we called Program 1. We only called it Program 1. We never used any words to describe the actual activities in this program. It took place in here. But this is where Program 1 took place, and it was Program 1 was the work that we did of defending those people who were accused of crimes against apartheid under the Sabotage Act, the Suppression of Communism Act, and so on.
The International Defence and Aid Fund is, as you know, committed to the task of providing humanitarian aid to the victims of racial oppression, not only of South Africa, but also of Rhodesia and of the 3 Portuguese-controlled territories in Africa. This patient struggle of South Africa will go down in history as an inspiration to future generations.
And now we're going into the rear of the building here, and this is where what we called Program 2 took place. And Program 2 was our welfare program. And our welfare program was to give assistance to the dependents of all those people that were imprisoned, detained, and sometimes hanged for their political activities in South Africa.
We were there to help any genuine opponent of apartheid, irrespective of race, colour, creed, you know, all that, which we did. I mean, we paid for the PAC as well, and quite a number of white people. I mean, there really was genuinely no discrimination. And he was very insistent that Defence and Aid must help everybody. It was for all opponents, not only for the ANC.
I speak as one who, together with the organisation over which I have the privilege to preside, is seemingly regarded by the South African government as an enemy, second only in precedence in that role to the liberation movements.
The communist smear, we lived with that all the time. But I mean, John was never remotely near the communists. I mean, he was a Tory until the war. He was a, conservative voter and supporter. No, but well, if you tell a lie often enough, it sticks, some of it.
At first, Defence and Aid operated quite openly. It all began with the arrival of a letter to Canon Collins from an English cleric working in South Africa and involved in the non-violent defiance campaign of the early 50s.
Trevor Huddleston wrote out of the blue, I mean, we didn't know him or anything, and he wrote to John and said, could Christian Action raise some money to look after the families of those who went to prison? And that's what we did. That's really more or less how it started. So we raised, well, it was really quite a lot of money in those days, about £800. I mean, you have to add several noughts to allow for inflation.
By the time IDAF closed itself down nearly 40 years later, it had sent into South Africa over £100 million, most of it in secret.
IDAF was about defence, that is to say, providing the best legal defence, particularly for those who were in danger of being condemned to death, as Mandela was, and his co-trialists in the Rivonia trial later on, of course. We needed top lawyers, white lawyers, who needed very high costs if they were going to defend the people that we wanted.
And then, of course, the next real thing was the Treason Trial, 1956 that was, wasn't it?
Lasting 6 years, the Treason Trial was the first major court confrontation between the apartheid state and its leading opponents. Both Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu were among the 156 people on trial.
John sent £100, I think, to Ambrose Reeves and said, brief the best lawyers and we'll guarantee to raise the money to look after them and to look after their families while the men are on trial and the women. And that's what we did.
150 people were thrown into jail and they had no time of organizing their own things. And their families, many of them were breadwinners, and their families had to live somehow. And Defence and Aid at that time was the hope of the people.
Before the end of it, there was Sharpeville in 1960, and that really stirred things up. That was when the international community began to come in, because that really went round the world. I think it was the first time a lot of people had woken up to what the South African government was really like.
Defence and Aid now also set about funding an independent inquiry into the Sharpeville massacre.
And money began to come in. It began to come in from different countries. And that was when Sweden came, and they, of course, became our major contributors. We couldn't have done it without them. And we raised all that money for the Treason Trial. It went on all those years, and we managed to pay all the lawyers and look after the families and the people and so on. And then, of course, it was a great triumph. They were all acquitted. It was wonderful. Great day that was.
The Defence and Aid Fund raised £250,000 during the Treason Trial, but Canon Collins was now to face a new dilemma.
We knew that ultimately our struggle was going to lead to armed struggle. We knew, too, that that depended with the reaction of the rulers.
Actually, it was Walter Sisulu, who wrote a letter saying if we turn to sabotage only, but of course we recognise there could be casualties, and what would be the attitude of Defence and Aid? Would you continue to defend us?
You know, the Christians have been one of the most revolutionary people, and therefore there was nothing that seemed to have been in conflict. They have had faced oppressions and took up arms against it. And I wasn't a pacifist. I didn't believe in that at all.
Canon Collins was a pacifist, but he was now being asked to support armed struggle. In May 1961, Nelson Mandela, fugitive from the South African police, secretly met him at St. Paul's Cathedral in London.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider.
We explained the decision that we had taken. His reaction was to continue supporting the struggle, and he left the actual form of struggle that should be adopted to the leadership that was in the forefront of the struggle inside the country.
The defence of sabotage cases after the launch of the armed struggle in 1961 heralded a new phase for Defence and Aid. In 1962, Walter Sisulu and 17 others were captured with bomb-making equipment at the Rivonia farm just outside Johannesburg. The Rivonia trial, held at the Palace of Justice in Pretoria, was the single most important court case under the apartheid regime. Defence and Aid paid the entire defence costs. Charged with sabotage, Sisulu, Mandela and 6 others faced the death penalty.
I thought that at least 4 of us were going to be hanged. Young boys were sentenced to 20 years. What were they going to sentence me, who is deliberately going for war? So I thought, well, there was no way we can escape it.
During the trial, a friendly warder asked me, Mandela, what do you think the judge is going to do with you? I said to the warder, they are going to hang us. He looked away from me and he said, yes, I think you're right, they are going to hang you. It was not a very pleasant statement to listen to. But there was an atmosphere at that time that we were going to be hanged.
And of course then that was when Nelson made his wonderful famous speech from the dock, which is one of the great speeches of the world, you know, it really is.
During my lifetime, I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
The decision is going to be death sentence.
What was the decision?
Life. That came to me as a relief. It was like a discharge when we were expecting death sentence.
And you spent the next 26 years in prison?
Yes.
Robben Island, the notorious jail for political prisoners, where Sisulu and the Black Rivonia trialists were sent for the next 2 decades.
Now I'll be there 3 minutes. 3 minutes I'll be there.
In those days, life meant life. And so the families of these political prisoners had to be supported, their wives and their kids. And so aid was always a necessary department of the Defence and Aid Fund. And at the same time, if you were going to keep going, you had to have effective publicity. You had to have very well-informed publicity. In other words, keeping the conscience of the world alive is how we put it. So there were those 3 departments in the Defence and Aid Fund.
So in fact, what developed eventually was a complete structure looking after the interests financially of a person who's committed what we termed an ideological crime. So we say under those circumstances, to some people it appealed because you're well looked after financially. All your needs are looked after. Your family needs, your children are getting bursaries and scholarships, only then. You are looked after whilst you're in prison. Your family are basically looked after. So those inhibitions, as I've said, which exist in any society, which keeps a man, even if he's very strongly opposed to a government, from getting involved in this type of matter, that was disappearing in this case. That is why the police said, no, we've got to try and prohibit this.
And so in 1966, under the Suppression of Communism Act, Defence and Aid was banned in South Africa.
Well, you see, then everyone thought, well, that's the end of IDAF. But it wasn't.
Canon Collins now began to set in place a secret structure as IDAF went underground.
I give notice to the nationalist apartheid regime in South Africa that I myself and the fund I serve will continue to defend the cause of freedom in that sunny but unhappy land till the liberation movements have succeeded in setting their people free.
From 1966, anyone receiving aid from IDAF was at risk, which was why it had to work in secret. To get money into South Africa, it now used a clandestine network of agents with a difference. These were private citizens who helped break apartheid by sending money to the families of its political enemies in tens of thousands of personal letters. It was all so secret that these letter writers often didn't know they were sending IDAF's money.
Well, I was teaching at a college in North London, and a colleague of mine on the staff was an exile from South Africa. And after she'd got to know me for a year or so, she asked me if I would be interested in taking part in this letter writing.
700 letter writers in 8 different countries sent the money. Extremely close friendships often developed.
Well, it quite staggered me at first because I hadn't realised what sums of money would be involved. And the first time it happened, a registered envelope arrived with the postman at the door, which had something like £300 or £400 in it, which to me in 1975 was a lot of money. It was all in cash, which I would then send off to the various people in South Africa with a covering letter saying who I was and that a friend of theirs had put me in touch with them. I knew that there was defence and aid in this country, but I didn't associate them directly with what I was involved with. Eventually I had something like 12 families that I was writing to. When I first became aware of the Mashambas, they were just one of the names on the list that I was asked to send money to. And gradually, over a series of letters, I pieced together that George was in prison for a long time, 15 to 20 years. And that at the time I first had any contact with them, Joyce was also in prison.
Detention, imprisonment has a very, very negative effect, to such an extent that if you don't handle the stress and whatever, you might end up breaking down, getting mad, committing suicide and all that. And that was the last thing that I wanted to happen with me, because I knew I had a loving husband, wonderful sons to live for. Hence I had to keep myself going.
And their 3 sons were being looked after by George's mother. And I'm fairly sure that George's mother didn't write. The letters that I received were written by a neighbour.
What they used to say was that we shouldn't worry, everything is okay, the children are being well looked after. We'll explain when you come out. When I left for prison, part of me went with all of them. They were with me. I could feel their presence. And then coming back, I felt so proud to be reunited with them. And for whatever questions I had, I always said, okay, it's all in the game of life.
And then one day I got a letter from Joyce saying that she had been released and introducing herself to me, saying what a comfort it was to her when she was in prison and to George, who was still in prison, to know that the boys and George's mother were being looked after in some way by money that they were receiving. But Joyce's own personal story was one of the most moving things I've ever read. That in the first letter that she wrote to me herself, she described how coming home after a long period in prison, she was getting down from the train, and at the far end of the platform, she saw an old lady and 3 boys, and these were actually her children, and she didn't recognize them. And even now, after all this time, I find it difficult to talk about Joyce's story without being moved.
We had to stand up and maintain the truth, stand for the truth, and say no to apartheid, because apartheid is a sin to humanity.
Once you're involved in writing the letters, it wasn't as impersonal as the campaign to free Mandela. I mean, it was flesh and blood. It was almost like relatives. And, once I had children myself, and then I could really relate to Joyce's experience. When George finally came out of prison, she told me that she and George had decided to have just one more child, so that they could both be there while that child was growing up, in the way that their commitment to the struggle had meant that they couldn't be for their boys, that they lost the childhood of their boys. She came to this house and stayed here.
I was looking forward to seeing a minister of religion, the one who has, sort of gone past being touched by worldly things and all that. But I was humbled to see David that I know of. When we first met, he broke down, he cried so bitterly. And we ended up joining him, sharing the tears. It was such a joyful moment because those tears were not just crocodile tears, but they were tears that cemented the relationship that we had with him. Like now, I'm very proud to say that David, Leslie, Charlie, and Conrad are part of our family. We might be miles apart, but we still have a common bond that ties us together.
I broke down, a bit like I am at the moment, and she didn't. Joyce has been through all of the worst of the nightmares and the worst experiences, and she coped with them in a very matter-of-fact way. And when she was in my house, she coped with me breaking down while I was saying how delighted I was to meet her at last and, you know, how much it meant to me. You know, I'd just been a name on a piece of paper, and equally she had been to me.
Once the organization was a banned organization, anyone inside receiving money from it could be clapped into prison, tortured, and all the rest of it. So we had to be very, very careful.
You know that the left movement throughout the world was heavily infiltrated by the South African intelligence organizations.
The International Defence and Aid Fund was, in my opinion, one of the very few anti-apartheid organizations that in fact was effective. An organization that used the money it was getting in a way that had a definite impact and effect on the South African state. It was also effective from a propaganda point of view.
IDAF's London headquarters now became a target of the South African secret police, BOSS, which wanted to know who they were sending money to in South Africa.
The difficulty was that they evolved a closed system where they trusted people that they thought they've screened well. But they could never screen themselves off completely from their colleagues in South Africa. They couldn't screen themselves off completely from a Craig Williamson.
I was regarded as somebody who supported black consciousness. I made sure that different people saw me in the way that they would like to see me.
Craig Williamson was South Africa's most successful spy. Based in Switzerland, he infiltrated, became deputy of, and eventually destroyed the International University Exchange Fund.
I progressed in rank right through to captain while I was a security policeman working undercover in the international anti-apartheid groups.
He was responsible for liaison with organizations like IDAF.
It was Horst Kleinschmidt who warned me that he's probably an agent. And he used to try to trick me. You know, he would say, I believe ABCD haven't any political defense. What are you doing about it? And I would say nothing.
Secrecy was now the name of the game. P was the code name of Defence and Aid's formidable General Secretary.
Well, if our files had been discovered, we would have put a lot of South African lawyers in jail, and we would have ended the possibility of defending people in political trials. And we would also have had to stop making welfare grants to their families. So I think that's why security became so important. It was important. We had either to be absolutely secure or give it up.
Well, I mean, actually, Phyllis used to annoy all our committees who were trying to raise money for us because she would never give them any information at all. They said, we can't raise money if we can't say anything. No, Phyllis, but it was Phyllis who saved us from Craig Williamson. I mean, he tried to get into Defence and Aid, but he just couldn't. Phyllis would have nothing to do with him at all.
IDAF protected itself through a series of cutouts. A firm of solicitors near St Paul's was taken on, to administer a legal deception and keep the money going to South Africa in spite of the banning there.
The secrecy was all important. I was known as Mr. X. Whenever a meeting was arranged with John Collins, he would phone up and he would say, "Hello, the boss wants to see you." The usual place meant Chapter House, the big place meant St. Paul's Cathedral. So if we were meeting in St. Paul's Cathedral, we would arrive at different times. And then I would slip into a pew, into a seat near them, and we would whisper. We were running a clandestine legal aid fund from abroad.
We understood the way the organization worked because it was in fact working very similarly to the way intelligence organizations work. We also, in the intelligence community, worked with cutouts to disguise the way we got payments from ourselves to our agents. So we understood very well the methods that they were using to cut out our ability to trace the payments from themselves to the people who were receiving the money in South Africa.
What Mr. X in London had done was to create an elaborate network of dummy trusts. Each of them had prominent wealthy establishment friends of the Collinses as trustees, and these trusts acted as fronts for IDAF.
By the time the money went out to South Africa, at that stage it belonged to one of the other trusts that we had established, Freedom from Fear International Charitable Foundation, or Freedom from Hardship International Trust. We had a trade union trust. So we had proper trustees, they maintained bank accounts, money flowed through those accounts.
The idea for forming these trusts came from a young law lecturer, Neville Rubin. He persuaded Canon Collins that the scheme would work so long as the trustees could plausibly answer the following question from South African lawyers.
Look, can you give us an absolute assurance that this is not the Defence and Aid Fund that you're asking us to act for? And my object in life was to set up a secure way in which they could honestly say, no, it is not the Defence and Aid Fund that has asked me to do this.
Instead of the money coming from the Defence and Aid Fund, all the money would go into my firm's Swiss account. I would then transfer the money into my firm's London bank account. From there, I would transfer the money to one of our agents, and they in turn would pay the money over to the South African lawyers. Sometimes the South African law firm would write and say, "Can you please confirm that the money does not emanate from the Defence and Aid Fund or any other organization which is regarded as illegal in South Africa?" We gave that confirmation.
You lied?
We didn't lie technically.
John was a wonderful liar, in an amiable way.
Collins's recruits from the great and the good included Lords Mitchison, Campbell and Snow. That they were pillars of the establishment was an essential part of the plan.
Hundreds of thousands of pounds of money went to South Africa, apparently coming from Lord Campbell of Eskin, a respectable, so-called respectable London businessman.
The charade was soon put to the test. In 1967, the South Africans alleged the defence costs of 37 Namibians facing the death penalty were being paid by IDAF, as indeed they were.
The defence stuck to their guns, that it came from me, and there was very little the South Africans knew about it. Of course, in the end, as you know, they weren't put to death. We saved their lives by this, I think.
So did you actually have to lie?
Absolutely.
Well, how
but I
did you
think
do it?
if there was ever a white lie, that was.
What was the lie?
Well, the lie was that the money was coming from me, which it wasn't. But I would certainly do it again.
And by this simple legal ruse, the recipients of IDAF money in South Africa were never put in danger.
The only way we could keep up the glimmer of hope and the struggle alive was through legal battles, by fighting all these harassments and repression imposed upon people. It was through the law. It was very difficult, and most times we did not succeed, but I must say that at the end of the day we did get some outcome from it.
As the struggle against apartheid intensified after the Soweto uprising in 1976, IDAF continued to pay for the defence in every political trial of any significance. It also made hundreds of thousands of welfare grants to the political victims of the system, even supporting entire communities driven off the land by discriminatory laws. At its peak, it was receiving £10 million a year from over 50 different countries. IDAF secretly paid for the family of Steve Biko to be represented at the murdered leader's inquest, and they funded the inquests of many others who died in police custody. But their activities did not go unnoticed.
We did our best to convince anybody we could that IDAF was in fact run by the South African Communist Party, and that the South African Communist Party was run by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and therefore if you listened to Defence and Aid Fund or gave them money, you were carrying out the will and aims and objectives in an international global sense of the Politburo in Moscow.
Because the Russians used to contribute a bit of money to Defence and Aid, and they had a plan for rescuing a certain number of prisoners by submarine from Robben Island. And what they wanted from John was if he could possibly get for them a plan of the island, and particularly a plan of the prison. But I thought it was an absolutely mad scheme, and I felt quite sure that MI5 would have known what was going on and so on.
Robben Island is not a prison only. Robben Island has a long and rich history dated back to 1488. This is our new power station. We generate our own electricity on Robben Island.
3 years after his release, Walter Sisulu, deputy president of the ANC, returns for the first time to the jail where he spent over 2 decades.
I used to see most of the Rivonia, in fact all the Rivonia trialists on Robben Island and thereafter on Paulsmoor. IDAF paid our funding. There was a time when we acted for more than 300 prisoners on Robben Island. We had a whole department in our office that only saw to the welfare of prisoners, political prisoners.
IDAF's publicity department in London campaigned for the release of these leading political detainees and kept up morale by secretly paying for wives and children to visit the island. It also funded prisoners' correspondence courses at the University of South Africa.
You know Major Dirk, Mr. Sisulu, Major Dirk Kirsten, he's head of the prison, Mr. Sisulu.
How do you do?
How do you do?
You had a visit once in 6 months. So you look forward to coming out. The very coming out of this door was a very important thing, just to come out of the door, to walk and meet your visitors there. You say, your day is made.
And how long would the visits be?
Half an hour. This was our block. You could speak to the man opposite. The windows sometimes were opened, but they only started opening, the whole corridor, and people walk at night in the 80s.
But these are too small. You cannot swing even a cat around.
As Walter's wife, Albertina Sisulu was aided by IDAF grants for more than 30 years. She was a leader of the United Democratic Front in the 1980s.
How many times were you in prison?
I can only remember 5 times.
The struggle became stronger because the men knew
that their families were being looked after. So despite whether they went to join MK or whether they went to jail for long periods, they knew their families were okay. And I think that was a very important fillip in the struggle.
As the struggle spread in the mid-80s, IDAF supported the families of many opponents of apartheid in the coloured areas of the Western Cape. Among them was the mother of Ashley Creel, the assassinated guerrilla.
Denmark, 26 April 1989. Dear Mrs. Ivy Creel, I write this letter to you because I have read about your son Ashley and how he died, and I am so sorry to think about it. I cannot help you with your son, but I would like to assist you from now on by sending you some money. Today I will send you 40 rand, and if you let me know if you receive the money, I will send you more money on a regular basis.
IDAF's grants to Mrs. Creel were secretly sent by Greta Hansen from Denmark.
We had 24 letter writers around Denmark. The money that was sent from all the Danish correspondents and all the correspondents around the world had to appear to come as a personal gift from one friend in one country to another friend in another country who had heard about the person in question's difficulties.
Dear Grete, thank you very much for your wonderful thoughts of love, sympathy, and blessings. It was such a joy to think that people unknown to me and my family are still interested in our well-being. God bless you. He was such a loving and kind-hearted boy. His desire was to work and fight for a free South Africa.
The last time I saw Ashley was on Christmas Eve, 1985. That was the last time I saw him. And then afterwards I heard that he has left the country to go for guerrilla training. He was shot by police.
Oh, I was nearly crying because to lose a boy, a son, a grown-up son, it must be very hard. And I felt deeply with her. And I felt a big shame because I'm white, because white people had killed her son.
I didn't actually know where the money was coming from. Every second month, I used to get money from Greta Hansen from Denmark.
It should look like we paid the money of our own, but we got the money from London.
I mean, we lost very little money over the years, I must tell you that. People sometimes ask me, I mean, look at the terrible things they do here in South Africa. They torture people, they hang them, they kill them, they're brutal to them. But how come this money goes through to the families? And I really had to sit and ponder it, you know. And I thought it's got something to do with Calvinism. You know, you don't touch the post. I mean, I don't know what else to think, you know, what makes them tick. But that money got through. That's all I can say. It was not stolen.
You must remember that opening letters coming into the country is done under a very strict supervision of a law, the Postal Act 118A, I think. There you've got to make out a case first. You've got to make out a case first that you think that an offence is being committed in terms of certain laws, and then you present this application to the Postal Department, and they intercede and they intercept it for you and give it to you, and then you're allowed to do it.
They knew it was us, but they couldn't prove it. There was nothing in any of the letters to say anything to do with Defence and Aid Fund. None of the letters came back to Defence and Aid Fund.
IDAF needed to know that the money was getting through. But to throw Boss off the scent, letters from South Africa confirming receipt of the money were never forwarded direct to IDAF's offices. Instead, they went to a house whose occupant was an unlikely undercover agent.
I'm John Sherrington. I'm a Catholic priest, a member of the Passionists. We have an orientation to share the life and work of ordinary people, and that's why I took a job as a road sweeper. I've been involved with IDAF for 6 years. They wanted a safe house as a drop, as a dead letter drop. There would be as much as perhaps 40 letters per day, and these were collected by people from IDAF. The whole thing had to be absolutely hush-hush. They knew from past experience that the boss was wanting to find out what they were up to, hence the need for everything to be absolutely secret.
By the time it closed, IDAF's network of letter writers had sent some £30 million in grants to the dependents of political prisoners. Another 70 million was paid for legal defence in trials.
What some other organisations are doing, which has collapsed just because they didn't have any funds any further, and then real chaos ensues, and that I think is happening now, and it's going to happen again. The next 18 months are going to be critical for the whole NGO sector in South Africa.
No one has yet done a study on the IDAF archives to work out precisely how many trials we assisted, how many accused people were assisted. I would think it must be tens of thousands of trials. We saved many people from the gallows. We were able to successfully have people's prison sentences reduced on appeal. We brought writs of habeas corpus to produce the body when people went missing. We supported inquests. We stopped torture going on.
I think the most important thing was to keep people going on in the struggle. That was more important than actually winning a court battle. Sometimes we won a battle in court, which was a tremendous victory for us. But the most important thing was, as I say, to keep people going.
IDAF's support meant that the political prisoners could afford to be patient.
There was a shed here where we used to eat. Yeah, shed. Very first time we went to the quarry, we were told to walk fast as they usually do with everybody. We decided we will walk, we will be very slow, that it will take the whole day to go to the quarry. And that forced them to negotiate. That forced them to go to Nelson and say, well, we now want to talk to you. That very day. That was our place here. So I was able to explain that you can't do what you like with us. Discuss, let's see what you're doing. We are confused too. Optimism and confidence and hope kept us alive. We knew that it was them who will come to a cul-de-sac. We, on the other hand, have a hope of finally succeeding. And therefore the events outside, at home and internationally, were a wonderful inspiration. And the Defense and Aid has done absolutely marvelous work, wonderful work.
IDAF's last and longest-serving employee is Maud Henry.
I started in February 1962. And I worked in the accounts section, in the treasury, as it now, is called. And this is it, this is the final bit, actually. The final bit.
A lot of people would have been executed. Many families, I don't know what would have happened to them, but for us, that's a good feeling to feel that you have helped really, literally thousands of human beings in the face of a really horrible tyranny. And that's probably the sort of best kind of feeling that you can have, something really practical.
Well, I thank you very much for what you have said, and I have nothing much to add. It has been one of the great assets of my life to be connected with this organization for now 30 years. It's now a very pleasant duty to take the final decision on the closure. The work will go on in South Africa. Thank you. The meeting is closed.
Thank you.
Afrika Tonga, ahunga akiwi hitihani, lunyani ribengo, kambe uta akiwa nsena hiri ranzu, Afrika Tonga. Itikorosa seka, tikora titabani milambuni situnga, misaba ya Afrika Tonga, inanile iliswakuta. Inaba akiba Afrika Tonga, ina mitobo ya kuhambana, kambe isimura ina iriwe. Isimura Afrika Tonga.
If you'd like to know more about the continuing work of Defence and Aid, please write to Defence and Aid, PO Box 3696, London N1 2LG.